Okay. Shabbat Shalom and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning service coming to you live from St. Francisville, Louisiana. Thank you for taking time out on this beautiful Sabbath to join with us. I'm looking forward to the class today. Thank you for joining us. This is class number 14, class 14 in our ongoing series on the 10 words, the 10-word covenant, and we are presently in word number 8, word 8. Again, I've mentioned this several times, but for those of you who may have just found us today, the reason that this is word number 8 in my study is that there are various ways to break these into number 1, number 2, and so forth. There are various religious traditions that have been developed that have said this is the way we number it. What I'm doing is following the spaces, the indications within the Hebrew Masoretic text of the Bible. So what these are is white spaces, and this is the beginning, according to those ancient divisions, these ancient white spaces. This is the beginning of word number 8. Now, word number 8 is translated generally something along these lines. In other words, if you look at any English translation, whether it's a Jewish translation or a Christian translation, most of them are going to say something along this line. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So like with all the other words that we've tackled thus far, we're going to get into what do the words mean? Have we adequately brought them into English, first of all? Are we representing in English what the Hebrew is trying to say? And then what are some examples that get us close as possible to the meaning? Now, I posted a meme, if you will, or a GIF file this weekend, or leading up to this weekend, to kind of announce the class. And it's this woman, and she says something like, you know you're lying. Because typically, people associate this command in some way or another with falsehood. In fact, popular in my area, I live in South Louisiana, and you can sometimes go to craft shows or whatever, and they'll have a Cajun version of the Ten Commandments. I know you've probably seen these. And the way that they represent this in the common vernacular, the common language of the area, they put on there, don't be lying. Don't be lying. But is that what it means? So the question is, what does it mean? First of all, is the English, thou shalt not bear false witness, is that representative of the Hebrew? If it's not, what is a better English translation? And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. Now, the first thing that I want to point out as we enter into this study on you shall not bear false witness, I want to point out a couple of the difficulties with that being the proper English translation. The word bear occurs nowhere in the Hebrew. Now, what does bear even mean? Typically, when people think of the word bear in this context, they're thinking of to carry, to transport, to prop up. In other words, don't support through false testimony, right? It has something to do with this idea. But the word bear doesn't occur. In fact, the phrase in the Hebrew that is translated not bear is the Hebrew lo ta'aneh. Lo ta'aneh. And lo ta'aneh occurs 37 times in the Tanakh, 37 times. Of those 37 times, only a few use the word bear in the English translation. And typically, it is either this verse, whether it's in Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 5, or another verse which is very, very close, but everywhere else, people are pretty consistent about translating lo ta'aneh as something other than not bear. So what is that, and why is that? So I'll tell you that if we look at the phrase lo ta'aneh, which is translated here, not bear, or you shall not bear, I guess is the best way to say it. If we look at this phrase, lo, most of you are learning Hebrew as we work through this, at least to a small degree. Lo is the negative particle. So lo means no or not. Lo, no, no. Ta'aneh, the tav, the T on the front, is the word for you, or it's the letter that represents the word you in this formulation. Anah. Anah is the root verb there that's translated bear, but in reality, literally, that word, if you look it up in any Bible dictionary or lexicon, it's going to be more accurately translated as answer or respond. Answer or respond. So, no, you shall answer or respond. Now, regardless, whenever you look at this, literally, I would say to begin with, in fact, you can go ahead and get your 10-word comparison chart out because we're going to look at it for a moment. But literally, this verse should begin not as you shall not bear, but literally, very literally from the Hebrew, it should be no, you shall answer, or no, you shall respond. No, you shall answer, or no, you shall respond. Now, if you look at the translation that I have here, my comparison chart of the 10 words in English, if we look at the left-hand column, it says, you shall not answer against your neighbor. And if we look at the first part of Deuteronomy 5, the only difference is, and you shall not answer against your neighbor. Now the reason, if you look at the Deuteronomy 5 column, you'll notice and is in red letters, which is the way I indicated difference between the two. So Exodus chapter 20 and verse 16 says, you shall not answer. Deuteronomy 5 verse 20 says, and you shall not answer. Only a slight difference. And in the Hebrew, it's only a single letter. It's the vav. All right? So what I'm showing here is that there's a single letter difference there. Now, before we go any further, I wanted to make a point that's very important in our study. Before we go into dissecting this word any further, if I'm correct that the word anah means to respond or answer, then I want to make the point that this word, this command, has to do with speech. All right? Now, I want you to let this sink in for just a moment. Whatever it is that this commandment, whatever it is that this word among the 10-word covenant, it's going to stand out as unique in some ways, and this one being very significant for our study, in that it deals with words, unlike some of the others. So the previous words that we've dealt with actions, okay? So let's put it this way. If we're talking about the previous words dealing with boundaries for human behavior, these previous words, especially as we're talking about those on human-to-human interactions, they deal with actions related to human behavior. So you have killing, murder, that would be, but that's an action. If you're talking about adultery, that's an action. If you're talking about stealing, that is an action. Now, when we get to this particular word, The thing that makes it stand out is now we're talking about the forbidding of certain speech. Certain speech is forbidden. This command, this word, governs human behavior wrong as it refers to human speech. So you could say that freedom of speech from a biblical perspective stops at truth. Now, we're used to talking about freedom of speech and so forth and so on, but I want you to understand that when it comes to human behavior, particularly as it relates to others, human behavior in this word, the command is to govern words. So you need to get that. Now, I wanted to read a particular verse to kind of kick that idea off. If you go to Exodus chapter 23, Exodus chapter 23, and I want to look at verse 1. Very important that we understand that the 10-word covenant goes beyond action and puts regulation on speech. So here we go. Exodus 23:1. You shall not raise a false report. Put not your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You shall not follow a multitude to do evil or bad, neither shall you speak in a cause to incline after a multitude to pervert justice, nor shall you favor a poor man in his cause. Now these rules, if you will, deal with proper conduct, and they have to do, in the most part, this particular portion of text, in the most part, with what is and is not permissible when it comes to speech, biblically speaking. When it says that you shall not raise a false report, literally, lotisa shema shava. This particular portion of this text is where it talks about a shema. It's something that's heard. So very literally, the idea being conveyed here is you're not supposed to lift or to carry something false that you heard. That's good advice. Be very careful, because there is a command about carrying a rumor, a false report. Now, in Jewish tradition, in Jewish law, there is a lot to do with, people have heard the phrase Leshon Hara. Leshon Hara. There's way more on that than I intend to get into today. But Leshon is the tongue, Hara is the bad or the evil. So the bad tongue, the evil tongue, is if you talk about, generally, this is a very broad definition, if you speak ill of someone, basically behind their back. Leshon Hara, the bad tongue, the evil tongue. So this portion of the Torah, Exodus 23, says you're not supposed to raise or carry a rumor, a false report. Notice the indication, I could put quotes around false. It's okay to talk truth, but the prohibition is on carrying something false that you heard today. You're not supposed to carry that forward. Now think about what the world would be if people weren't so easy to cave into the multitude and do bad. Notice this says, put not your hand with the bad to be an unrighteous witness. Now in Hebrew that could be it's even harsher than that. In fact, it says an ed chamas. Chamas means violence or wrong. So just because everybody is saying something doesn't make it right. And it's a warning here that you're not to join the multitude to be a wrong witness, to testify of wrong or violence. And then it goes on and it gives other rules associated with the rendering of justice. So I want to make this point very clearly that the Torah takes and presents, it forms boundaries of human behavior that go beyond just the action. It's a crime for me to take an object that belongs to someone else. We covered this thoroughly. It's wrong for me to take another person's woman. It is also wrong to say things in certain contexts, to use speech to inflict harm on an individual. And that is the point of today's class, is to show that speech is also governed by this remarkable 10-word covenant. So last week, I said that the 10 words establish boundaries for human behavior, whether those boundaries deal with humans' interactions with the divine or human interaction with human. There are plenty of different ideas out there. People have suggested, though it's not based on Scripture, that you had 5 of the commands, if you will, that deal with human to divine interactions. Those were written on one tablet, and there were 5, another pentad as we call it, dealing with human to human. They were written on the other. Nowhere in the text does it say that. But what I'm beginning to see and what I'm beginning to present, and this goes forward in the next few classes, further and more difficult, I would say, is that not only do these deal with human to divine and human to human, but they deal with governing every piece of our being, our actions, our words. And I think that next week I'll even show you that it goes beyond that to the things that we think. Now, some of you might not believe that yet, but you haven't heard next week's class, so just stay tuned. So we're talking about right now that the 10-word Hebrew covenant deals with wrong inflicted in both deed and in word. So our word today, you shall not bear false witness, or more accurately, you shall not answer or respond against your neighbor. Now we're going to get into some other difficulties associated with the text. But before I do, I want to say this. This word deals with our interactions with our neighbor. So a point that we've got to really get into in this class, in addition to understanding what the Hebrew words mean in this word, we also have to concern ourselves with how do we define the word neighbor? You know, I mean, how broadly, how narrowly. If we look at in Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5, these are our only 2 versions, both of which claim to be an accurate representation of the covenant that was delivered at Horeb, the covenant that was delivered at Sinai. We have these 2 versions of that account, and they have differences. Now, how significant are the differences? This is what we have to ask ourselves. Does the one in Exodus represent actually what was communicated at Sinai or Horeb? Does Deuteronomy 5 more accurately represent the covenant that was delivered at Horeb at Sinai? Is there something we can learn from looking at both of them? Because there are distinct differences. One of those differences occurs in this command, in this word. If you look at it on my chart, in Exodus chapter 20, and verse 16, my translation draws out the difference. It says, you shall not answer against your neighbor as a lying witness. You shall not answer or respond against your neighbor as a lying witness. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 20, it says, and you shall not answer against your neighbor as a false witness. As a false witness. Now, if you look at this, you have to ask yourself, is that really a significant difference? The reason that I draw this out and that I translate it differently in the English in my chart is because the Hebrew underlying it is different. There's one word used in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 16, which I translate lying, and there is another word that's used in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 20 that I translate as false. Now, if you ask someone, or if you look at it, you go, well, I mean, arguably, one might suggest that the meaning is essentially the same. Lying, falsehood. You know, I mean, how is that really worth bringing out? Well, I think it is. I think we ought to be very careful. I think we ought to be not skeptical with the text, but I think we ought to be critical. I think we ought to be careful in our examination and in our study, and we ought to draw out from this whatever might be the subtle differences between the two. What does it mean? Why do they read differently? But the bottom line is, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 16 reads differently than Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 20. In a general way, we know that whatever this word is saying, it deals with lying or falsehood, and it has to do with a crime against one's neighbor. So I want to take us to this idea of who is our neighbor. That becomes very important whenever we look at this. It's the most important part. In fact, from this point to the end of the covenant, the word neighbor is going to occur quite a few times. So who is the neighbor in this particular context? Because whatever it is, whoever it is, we're dealing now with a portion of the covenant that deals with wrong inflicted by words in regards to one's re'ah. In Hebrew, re'ah. Now, re'ah is translated as neighbor. From the verbal form of the word, ra'ah, it means to be associated with. So some translations don't use the word neighbor, but the idea of being connected with another individual, it's sometimes translated as companion. Sometimes it's translated as the word friend, sometimes fellow. But the idea at its base is biblically, the question comes up, who is my neighbor? With whom am I associated with? Should I define the term in a broad way, or should I define the term in a narrow way? Now we're going to get into in a few moments, what does it mean to answer or respond against a neighbor with a false or lying, or as a false or lying witness? But who's my neighbor is the first question I want to deal with. So I want to define neighbor as the Bible defines neighbor. Is that fair? As one who is standing in a reciprocal relationship. Sometimes the Bible defines neighbor in a narrow sense. Sometimes the Bible defines neighbor in a very broad sense. And I think we serve ourselves properly if we treat it the same way. And I'll make that point very clearly here in a moment. But a few examples, I believe, are due in order to show the full possibility or the flexibility, if you will, of the term re'ah, translated neighbor. And so we'll look at a couple of texts and see what the Bible says about who is my neighbor, because you and I might say, you know, that person isn't my neighbor. They don't even live in the same town. You know, you could say that, or that person is not my neighbor because they're not part of my group, my ethnic group, my neighborhood, my what. People can be very narrow in their definition of neighbor. So let's look at a couple of texts. In order to get at this, we're going to have to look at a few passages primarily from the Holiness Code in Leviticus 19. Now, one of the most commonly known verses in all of the Bible is taken out of context, and it's not even quoted in full. And here's what it is. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Do you know that that's not even that entire verse? It's only a half of a verse. That's a good half, and I love that it has permeated the world. I love that people know this snippet from the Hebrew Bible, but it's not really understood. It's taken out of context, and very few people, if I told people, close your Bible and quote for me the full verse, from which we get, love your neighbor as yourself, I would bet that there would be a low score on that test. I'm just saying. Now, you don't have to be honest with me, even though we're talking about lying and falsehood, but I want you to think about that. Could you do it? It's important. All right, now, I want to go to the Holiness Code. We're talking about who is my neighbor. Who is my neighbor? So I want to go to Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus 19. And I want to begin Leviticus 19 at verse 15. Leviticus 19, verse 15. You shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. You shall not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. Now, what this means is, don't misread this, it's saying judgment does not bend because of social status. If someone is poor and they're wronged, you cannot change the way you respond, whether that person is the poorest of the poor or the wealthiest of the rich. You might have empathy. You might say, oh, that person is so poor, they didn't have anything. And treat it regardless of station in life. That's justice. You know, somebody might look at a rich person. If a crime is committed and someone stole something from them, some people would actually, especially now, a lot of times I hear this, people say, they've got plenty. It's like, it doesn't matter if something was taken from them because they have plenty. That is anti-scriptural. That's anti-justice. Justice shall you pursue is what the Bible says. And it must be equal. Totally equal. Now, continuing on with our verse. But in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go up and down as a talebearer among your people. Neither shall you stand aside when mischief befalls your neighbor. I am Jehovah. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall certainly rebuke your brother and not suffer sin on his account. You shall not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Jehovah. There's a lot of context there. Yes, you should love your neighbor as yourself, but if you look at the context and you study the entire thing, what we're talking about is justice, and justice distributed according to the standard of righteousness, treating equally people who appear before the court, if you will. And all of this is in the context of you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, that love that it's talking about, it's not just some fluffy nothing like, oh, I sure love my neighbor. Demonstrate affection towards another one through administering proper justice. That's what it's really talking about. I'm not saying you shouldn't love your neighbor and bring them some nice things from time to time. But what this is talking about is proper treatment of individuals is essential to administer justice. And the way that this is sort of underscored is, God says, let me explain it. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. In other words, treat them as you would want to be treated. Right? You understand that? So when I look at this particular passage, there are two different words that are translated as neighbor, but they're used interchangeably. There's also, within what I just read, the use of the term brother. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, and so forth. There is also used the phrase, sons of your people. Now, if I look at this, and I read it, and I say, my brother, sons of my people, my neighbor, my neighbor then is one of my own. You see how I could get very narrow very quickly by reading this small section of text. I could begin to define my neighbor as one of my own, as a white person, for instance, as a brown person, as a black person, as a whatever group you want to plug in there, as an Israelite. An Israelite may have read this in antiquity or heard this and said, my brother is the fellow Israelite. That's it. I'm only responsible for loving that person. But is that the way the Bible defines neighbor? Look down, same chapter, Leviticus 19. It's part of the Holiness Code. This, just like Leviticus 19:18 above. And look down at verse 33. And if a stranger sojourn with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. But the stranger that dwells with you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself. Because you were strangers in the land of Egypt, I am Jehovah your God. You shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, so forth and so on. So you can see that if a person were to read Leviticus 19:18 and say, I have to love my neighbor as myself, but that's only a fellow Israelite or only a whatever you want to plug in there. But if you keep reading, this is proven to not be the case. That justice extends beyond the narrow confines that people might tend to place it, to the point that the children of Israel are told, and you are told, Leviticus 19:33 and following, that even a stranger who sojourns among you, love him as yourself. It expands that idea. Now, look back in Leviticus 19 Look at verse 13. You shall not defraud or oppress your neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning. Last week we talked about theft. So this is, you're not supposed to rob your neighbor. Well, who's my neighbor? Again, think about the context and the setting and everything that this chapter has to say about that. Now, based upon what we read in Leviticus 19, 15, and 16, leading up to love your neighbor as yourself, I want you to notice that slander, that bad words are forbidden against your neighbor. You're not supposed to use words to inflict wrong upon your neighbor, broadly defined neighbor. Think about that. If you can inflict wrong in words and deeds, and neighbor is defined broadly, then we begin to start getting closer at the meaning and the full reach of the 10-word covenant. Now, this is not just, as we see in Leviticus 19, having to do with our own family, our own clan, or even strangers dwelling among us. Let me give you a little bit more. Go with me to Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. We're going to see how broadly the Bible can define the word neighbor. Exodus 3, verse 21. Exodus 3, verse 21. And I will give this people favor in the sight of Egypt, and it will come to pass that when you go, you shall not go empty. But every woman shall ask of her neighbor, and of her that sojourns in her house, jewels of silver and jewels of gold and garments, and you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, and you shall despoil Mitzrayim, or Egypt. Now, in this particular passage, one's neighbor is even the people of Egypt, the so-called enemy in the Exodus story, if you will. Look at Exodus chapter 11. Exodus chapter 11 and verse 2. Exodus chapter 11 and verse 2. Speak now in the ears of the people, and let every man ask of his neighbor, and every woman of her neighbor, jewels of silver, jewels of gold, and Jehovah gave the people favor in the sight of Egypt. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. I wanted to take that detour to show you that when it comes to neighbor, you can think of it in a narrow sense, but biblically, quite often, it extends to those around you, whether they be your family, your clan, or not. You're associated with them. You encounter them. They are a person that can be at any given moment in a reciprocal relationship with you. That really should give us pause. Because you could come in contact with people who hold different political views, who hold different religious views, who are of different ethnic origin, and all of them biblically are your neighbor. What would the world be if it truly captured the essence of that portion of a verse? Not even a full verse, but if they could just grab that part of the verse that says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Just that. If you said, I'm going to start a ministry and this is all I'm going to teach, and in every way I'm going to try to bring this point across, wouldn't that be a better world? Now, So even the Egyptians in Exodus 3:22 and Exodus 11:2 are considered neighbors. So we have to be careful because even the enemies in the biblical world can at any point become the companions. Give you an example. If you read Isaiah chapter 19, in Isaiah chapter 19, it reaches a place where Egypt is even considered God's people. That's an amazing story. If people will think about that, when you read the Exodus itinerary, the narrative of the Torah when they're leaving Egypt and the Pharaoh and the people are destroyed and the firstborn are still, it's a story of the defeat of one's enemies. Songs being sung on the shore about the defeat of the enemy. But by the time you get to Isaiah 19, it's talking about that Assyria and Egypt are my people with Israel. So when dealing broadly with wrong inflicted to a broadly defined neighbor, consider these passages. I want you to look with me at Psalm 15. Psalm 15. A psalm of David. Jehovah, who shall abide in your tent? Who shall dwell in your holy hill? He that walks uprightly and acts justly and speaks truth in his heart. He that does not slander with his tongue, nor does evil to his fellow, nor takes up a reproach against his neighbor, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors them that fear the Jehovah. He that swears to his own hurt and changes not, he that does not put out his money on interest, nor takes a bribe against the innocent, he that does these things shall never be moved. You notice that quite a bit of this has to do with truth. It has to do with not being slanderous, not using vile speech, not attacking one's neighbor. All of these things are what establish a person in a righteous way. Speaks truth, does no slander, no evil to his neighbor. Look at Psalm 101. Psalm 101. In verse 5. Psalm 101, verse 5. Whoever secretly slanders his neighbor, him will I cut off. Slandering of a neighbor is grounds to be cut off. Now let's go through a couple of Proverbs. Proverbs 11 and verse 9. A hypocrite destroys his neighbor with his mouth, but the just shall be delivered through knowledge. A hypocrite destroys his neighbor with his mouth. You realize that you can, with your words, inflict harm? Look at Proverbs 24. Proverbs 24 and 28. And one of the reasons I'm stressing these ancillary commands and good advice from the Scripture dealing with words and neighbors is because we live in an internet age in which it is easy to follow the multitude and to get on some bandwagon and to attack a person based on their otherness. We really, really have grown bad at this, or we've gotten good at it, which is bad, in that we follow the multitude, we copy and paste and post and share and tweet and retweet something that someone says, and then quite often it's not thoroughly investigated. And I can tell you that that is bad. from whether it's a politician that's being bashed, whether it's a person who believes that their person is wholly righteous, W-H-O-L-L-Y, and the other candidate is wholly wicked, when we don't give one any credit where credit is due. All of these things we have to think about. Words matter. It's very important that we understand this. Proverbs 24:28. Be not a witness against thy neighbor without cause, and deceive not with your lips. Deceive not with your lips. Now, I think we're getting a little closer to our word, to the command, to the word about bearing false witness, but we're going to get to that. Look at one more verse. I want to take you to the prophet Jeremiah, and I just want to read Jeremiah chapter 9, Jeremiah 9, and I want to begin in verse 2, or verse 1 in the Hebrew. It says, "Oh, that I were in a wilderness, in a lodging place of wayfaring men." Now, I just added this verse because I miss being in the wilderness, but it's leading up to the passage that I want to highlight. "That I might leave my people and go from them, for they are all adulterers, an assembly of treacherous men. They bend their tongues, their bow of falsehood." Notice that your tongue is compared here with a bow of falsehood. Wow. "But they are not valiant for the truth upon the earth, for they proceed from evil to evil, and they know me not, says Jehovah. Take heed every one of his neighbor, and trust not in any brother, for every brother acts deceitfully, and every neighbor goes about with slanders. And they deceive everyone his neighbor and don't speak the truth. They've taught their tongue to speak lies and weary themselves to commit iniquity. Your habitation is in the midst of deceit. Through deceit they refuse to know me, says Jehovah." My point in bringing this passage in is that falsehood and deceit and speaking untruth separates us from God. Very clearly. People ought to be absolutely concerned with speaking the truth. Freedom of speech in a biblical perspective stops at the truth. If you don't know if it's true, don't say it. If you don't know that it is not confirmed, don't repeat it. Otherwise, you're carrying something you heard, Shema, a false rumor, and you're destroying lives. You could destroy businesses. You can destroy all sorts of things because Uncle Billy shared a cute meme on Facebook. We have to be careful. And if there's vitriol and hatred in a political campaign, be careful about what you say even in that. Very important. We need to think about words. False, lying witness. Now, while both of these words are attested in the Tanakh, Deuteronomy, remember in my translation, I show that Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, they have different words. One says a lying witness, the other says false witness. Now, if you look at the phrase that's translated false witness in Deuteronomy, that phrase occurs only here in this verse one time in all the Tanakh. Just once. Nowhere else is the phrase that's translated false witness in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 20. It does not occur in a single other place in all the Hebrew Bible. It doesn't even occur in Exodus 20 in the verse that is corresponding to it, because Exodus 20 uses a different word. There is, however, a connection with another word among the 10 words. If you look on my sheet, on the first page, Exodus chapter 20, verse 7, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 11, it says, "No, you shall lift the name of Jehovah your Elohim for falsehood, because Jehovah will not clear one who lifts his name for falsehood." That word in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 read exactly the same. It employs the word falsehood that is used in Deuteronomy chapter 5 that we just read in Deuteronomy 5 verse 20 as a false witness. That same Hebrew root word is used here. So I want to make a point. In the first one, in Deuteronomy chapter 5 verse 11 and Exodus chapter 20 and verses 7, dealing with false oaths, this has to do with speaking falsehood from your mouth, and it's a crime in the human and divine realm. You follow me? In this one, when it's talking about in a dealing with your neighbor, you have words inflicting harm towards a neighbor. So what this tells me is that the 10-word covenant not only deals with forbidden actions associated between the human and divine realm, such as don't make idols, don't bow to idols, don't so forth, don't serve them, but also don't use falsehood in your oath. So it concerns actions and words. In the human-to-human realm, where we're dealing with things such as don't kill, don't adulterate, don't steal, and oh, by the way, don't answer or respond against your neighbor as a lying witness. So the actions and the words are evident in the 10-word covenant in our dealings with God and with man. Very, very important, and we'll take this further in future classes. But the phrase used in Exodus chapter 20, Ed Shaker, a false witness, occurs 9 times in the Hebrew Bible. And I believe that if we look at these passages, what we will see is a little bit better understanding of what these mean. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through these 9 times that false witness, Exodus chapter 20's wording, occurs. That exact phrase occurs 9 times. Once in Exodus 20, we're going to skip that. Now I want you to go to Deuteronomy 19, and I want to get a better understanding of what this command is. This exact phrase is used in 9 places. Deuteronomy 19. And we're going to begin in verse 15. Deuteronomy 19:15. One witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin, in any sin that he may commit, at the mouth of 2 witnesses, or at the mouth of 3 witnesses shall the matter be established. If a false witness, here's our phrase, rise up against any man to testify against him that which is wrong, then both the men between whom is the controversy shall stand before Jehovah, before the priest and the judges, which is what the previous phrase means, who shall be in those days, and the judges shall make diligent inquiry, and behold, if the witness is a false witness and has testified falsely against his brother, then shall you do to him as he had thought to have done to his brother. so shall you put the evil from among you, and those who remain shall hear and fear, and shall henceforth commit no more any such evil among you, and your eye shall not pity, but life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Get this. What if, this is what this is saying, if I bring charges on you, and those charges are not supported by the evidence, and it is shown through the courts that I have lied against you. If I claim that you robbed, stole, whatever, and my goal was to get you removed from your job or whatever, if it's not proven, and you can think about modern applications today, if you're exonerated, then the person who brought the charges, that happens to them. Now, what if that were going on today? What if someone who accused someone falsely, and it was shown to be false, if they accused them of theft or they charged that they should lose their job? What if they said, okay, you tried, you brought these charges up, they were disproved, now you lose your job? You know what that does? It says that this brings about justice, and it also causes people to be a little more careful. If I can bring somebody up on charges and I can't prove it and they get off and nothing happens to me even though it was proven that I was a false witness, you see, you're not supposed to lie against someone, which is what our word is dealing with. A testimony in Hebrew is aid. So it's talking about bringing forth testimony or witnessing. You're not allowed to lie under that circumstance. Notice the sentence for this. If you bring forward a false testimony, you get the sentence for what you wanted the other one to get. I think it's very interesting. Now go with me to Psalm 27. Psalm 27. We're going through the passages which use the phrase false witness. Psalm 27 and verse 12. Deliver me not over to the will of my enemies, for false witnesses are risen against me, and such as breathe out violence. False witnesses are risen against me and breathe wrong or violence. In Hebrew, vayipeach Hamas. These false witnesses exhale, they breathe out wrong and violence. I think that's a good description of a false witness, to breathe out wrong. And they don't even care. It's intentional to breathe out Hamas, wrong. Now I want you to look at Proverbs Chapter 6. You think this is serious? Let me show you how serious this is. And I want us to try to apply it in our modern world. Think about opportunities where we can avoid entangling ourselves with breathing wrong things. We haven't proven them to be true. Proverbs Chapter 6, verse 16. You ready? There are 6 things which Jehovah hates, and 7 which are an abomination to Him. Get ready. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked thoughts, feet that are swift in running to mischief, a false witness that breathes out lies, and one that sows discord among brothers. Now, the first thing I want to do is tell you that there is a difference, both of which are hated, by the way. God hates a lying tongue, a Leshon Hara, a tongue that lies. But that's not a false witness. They're the same in some ways. They're both have to do with speaking things that aren't true. Some people just lie just to lie. You ever hear that? That person lies all the time. Lie, lie, lie. That's a lying tongue. God hates that. It's an abomination to him. But another thing that he hates, which is similar, and that is an ed shaker, which is a false witness. It's qualified further in this way. So you want to know what a false witness is? It says, breathes lies and sends forth discord among the brother. Breathes out lies. So they're a liar, but they also stir the pot. That's what a false witness is. All right, let's work through a couple more. I want you to go with me to Proverbs 12. Proverbs 12 and verse 17. He who utters truth gives just or righteous evidence, but a false witness utters deceit. There is one who speaks like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise is health. You speak truth, you provide righteousness, basically. You're speaking forth righteousness. But a false witness sends forth deceit. Literally in Hebrew, Proverbs 12:17 says that you have the one who breathes out truth. The word for breathe is used for truth, and then the false witness breathes out deceit. So it's a matter of what do you exhale? What comes out of your mouth? Because I believe, even in this saying that is quoted in the Gospels, where what comes out of the mouth, it's what really is in the heart. You start breathing out false claims or whatever, it's prevalent in our time. You didn't investigate it. You're defending your position because you think that you've defended it because you think it's right, and you don't even care if it's right. You're breathing out wrong. That's what it says. Look at Proverbs 14. Proverbs 14 and verse 5. A trusty witness, in fact, in Hebrew it's ed imunim, a truthful witness, is he that does not lie, but he that utters lies is a false witness. Pretty clear, right? You speak the truth, you literally breathe the truth, you're a true witness. You speak falsehood, you breathe falsehood and violence and wrong, you destroy life, you can destroy people's reputation, and it's evil. Proverbs 19 and verse 5. 19:5, a false witness shall not go unpunished, and he that utters lies shall not escape. Look down at verse 9. A false witness shall not go unpunished, but he that utters lies shall perish. Pretty serious business. Proverbs 25:18 is the last one that uses false witness. 25:18. A man who bears false witness, Proverbs 25:18, against his neighbor. Now this is very close to the language in our text. Is like a maul and a sword and a sharp arrow. These are all implements of killing. A false witness is here compared to methods of destroying someone's life, their reputation. The 10-word covenant provides boundaries for human behavior, for human interactions with the divine and human interactions with other humans. These interactions and these boundaries that are set forth in the 10-word covenant govern our behavior in both words and deeds. And as we'll see next week, they even govern human behavior in our thoughts. I'll leave you with this one thing. We as a collective people, broadly defined, should be very careful about the words that come out of our mouth, about the judgments that we pass. We ought to be extremely careful to utter truth, because by speaking falsehood, by being a false witness, we breathe out wrong, we breathe out destruction, and it's way more serious than people give it credit. Words matter. Shabbat Shalom.